1. Order. Welcome to the Public Accounts Committee on Wednesday, the 24th of April 2024. Today we're examining the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero's plan for decarbonising home heating by 2050. And some of us who've been around a while have seen many promises by different governments about net zero housing and talk about decarbonising our home heating sector. And that's really because heating homes accounts for around 18%, so nearly 1 in 5 of all UK greenhouse gas emissions. And decarbonising home heating is therefore one of the biggest challenges to net zero. To achieve it, nearly all households in the UK would have to switch from fossil fuels to low-carbon alternatives, and the government has, among other things, an aim to install at least 600,000 heat pumps in households by 2028, so that's only 4 years away. But one of the reasons we're here today is that fewer households than expected have installed heat pumps, and this committee's looked at this in the past and highlighted some of the challenges for the consumer, different types of property, and the many barriers in the way to delivering this. So we want to really tease out with our witnesses how realistic the targets are, and if they're not, what plan B is. So I'd like to welcome our witnesses. We have, of course, Jeremy Pocklington, the Permanent Secretary at the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero. Welcome back to you. He's joined by the Director General for Net Zero Buildings and Industry at the Department, Ben Rimmington, and a first-time witness at the committee, David Capper, who's the Director of Net Zero Buildings at the Department. So a warm welcome to you all. Before we go into the main session, Olivia Blake just wanted to chase up on progress on some information that you should be providing to us.
Yeah, and I also just have a quick declaration of interest that my husband is the company secretary of a community benefit society who fund, develop, own and operate renewable energy systems in South Yorkshire, called Sheffield Renewables. But my question is relating to the publication of the plan to decarbonise the power sector. Previously we've heard that it should have been by spring 2024. Is there any updates on when that will be published?
Yes, so very soon the department will be commissioning the system operator. Well, I think when we last had a hearing, it was called the Future System Operator, and we're now calling it NESO now, the National Energy System Operator, to start to produce a spatial energy plan, which will be the key plan for decarbonising the power sector. The government's ambition is to do that by 2035. I think the best thing would be, Ms Blake, is once we've formally done that in public, perhaps I should write to the committee at that point with an update of how all these things fit together.
Okay, so and roughly, so then when you'll be writing to us?
I can't give you a precise time, but it's in the next couple of months. That sort of time.
Okay, just we're aware that an election is coming. We're all kind of keen to know this stuff before that point. So okay. Well, thank you for that. So we now move into the main session, looking particularly at this challenging issue of why it's taken so long to get heat pump uptake to the levels that the government's expected. And I'm going to ask Olivia Blake MP to kick off. Ms Blake, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. The first question is a simple one. Why has demand for heat pumps been lower than expected? And that's to David Capper, please. Mr. Capper.
Or Mr.
Do you want me to do it?
This question to Mr. Capper.
Mr. Capper, your debut.
Thank you very much. You're correct that we have not, under the boiler upgrade scheme, which is the main grant scheme for heat pumps, we have not spent all of the budget. So we had a budget of 150 million in each of 3 years. And in the first year we spent about 50 million, and the second year the projection is that we'll spend around 88 million, or that's subject to final reconciliations. I mean, the main challenges have been is the capital cost issue. So the grant level was 5,000 to start with, but we have now increased that to £7,500 in response to levels of demand. We have the running cost issue. So for many people, it's still cheaper on the running cost basis for them to have a fossil fuel boiler than it is for them to have an electric solution like a heat pump. We've got supply chains to grow from very low levels, so both manufacturing in the UK but also numbers of installers. There are issues in the installation process that we've been addressing, such as the energy efficiency requirements, the planning requirements that the distribution network operators have in terms of the installation process. And these are all things that we're looking to address in order to increase uptake.
Ms. Blake.
Just following up on the energy efficiency requirements that you just mentioned, I thought it was interesting that the department has changed the goalposts somewhat on what people should expect in terms of loft installation, and there was this response, I think, that came out last month.
That's correct.
The record, Ms. Blake, just read into the title of the paper.
Yeah, so it's Boiler Upgrade Scheme Consultation Response, and just that it kind of outlined that it was no longer necessary to have it permits that people will no longer need to have the minimum standards for loft and cavity wall insulation before being able to put a heat pump in. Can you just explain why that decision has been taken and what the positive and negatives are of that decision? Yeah.
So what the government's decided is to make it a choice for consumers. So at present still, because we haven't yet changed the rules, that rule change will come in next month. But at present, if you've got a EPC recommendation for loft or cavity installation, for cavity insulation, then you need to do that in order to be able to access the Boiler Upgrade Scheme grant. And what the government is doing is changing that to say that, yes, whilst the government is still recommending to householders that they do cavity and loft insulation in line with their EPC recommendations, we're not making that a requirement of accessing the grant. So we're essentially leaving it as a choice for the householder to decide whether they want to do the cavity and loft insulation beforehand, at the same time, or indeed afterwards, or maybe never, when installing a heat pump. And this is in response to new evidence which shows that actually a very high proportion of UK homes, so 80 to 90% of UK homes, don't need additional insulation in order to be able to install a heat pump and for that heat pump to work effectively.
Can you just talk a bit more about the evidence for that? Because that seems like quite a shift in policy. So I'd like to understand that a bit more clearly.
Yeah, so from studies of the building stock in the UK, we've looked at that, and we've looked at the extent to which insulation is needed or not needed. And what the evidence says is that, as I say, in 80 to 90% of homes, you don't need to have additional insulation for the heat pump to work well. Now, clearly, if you put in additional insulation, it will have other effects, like it will help reduce your bill, for example. So there are very much benefits doing that, which is why the government is still recommending that people do it. But it's not a requirement in order to access the heat pump grant, because you can have a heat pump and it can work well in your home without the additional insulation.
Quite a lot of the evidence we've had has kind of advocated for fabric first kind of approach. Obviously this is not that approach. Are you concerned about potential impact on future energy supplies if people don't do energy efficiency measures as a result of this policy change?
Yeah, so I mean, the government is definitely not saying that fabric isn't important. So fabric is important. It's just in this particular instance, what we found in when we've been looking at the barriers for heat pump deployment is that one of the barriers is that households who were trying to put in a heat pump were finding that they had EPC recommendations for either cavity or loft, and either those EPC recommendations weren't what they wanted to do in their home, or weren't maybe in their view suitable for their home. And so we've just what the government's done is put this choice in the hands of householders and allowed householders to decide what is best for their own home.
Mr. Rimmington would like to add something.
Just on a minor point, if I may, the requirement to take action on EPC recommendations, that in certain circumstances it was complicating the customer journey quite significantly in terms of having to sequence the work, and that was one of the factors impacting uptake of the grant. So there was a very practical reason. It doesn't indicate a wholesale shift in policy away from the importance of fabric.
Can I ask Mr. Pocklington, is this decision more about meeting the target for heat pumps in that case than what is ultimately best for consumers in the longer term?
No, I wouldn't agree with that characterisation. Really, this is about making the customer journey as simple as possible, maximising choice for householders. It is obviously a big change. Everyone knows this. Getting a heat pump in a property, and we want to make sure that is as simple as possible for consumers. As my colleagues have said, we are still recommending cavity and wall insulation in properties.
Do you think more could be done on energy efficiency by the department?
Well, energy efficiency is a very, very important topic. My department is investing considerable sums of money on energy efficiency, including on sort of the heat pump. We're spending, I think, around about £12 billion this Parliament. We've got, again, including consumer funding and taxpayer funding, so far £7.5 billion allocated for the next Parliament on this broad agenda of energy efficiency and clean heat. So it's obviously a very, very important agenda, and there's a range of policies to support a range of building types and a range of householders.
We've obviously had moving on, and this is to all, we've had a range of different consumer energy schemes in the past, such as Green Homes Grant and smart meters, with rather patchy outcomes. Have you learnt any lessons from those poor performances in those schemes, and how are you applying them to the current schemes?
We obviously do seek to learn from our experience and the delivery of previous schemes, although I would note that every scheme is slightly different, and you need to also adapt your learning for the circumstances you're in. But two things that I would highlight that I'm sure we'll be covering in the committee today are, first of all, new schemes do start slowly, and that is because you're working with a supply chain. And you need to think about how that supply chain will adapt, how contracts will be negotiated, and that's why we took a staged approach with the introduction of the boiler upgrade scheme to ensure that, for example, the payment system worked before we expanded it. And secondly, and it'll be a common theme for this committee, there's always a trade-off between simple schemes and more complex schemes that can be more precisely targeted. And again, I think a lesson here is often actually the simpler model is often the better model to go for. I recognise there are choices and trade-offs there, but that's why with the boiler upgrade scheme, again, to use that, we have a relatively targeted scope, quite a flat rate grant. We've gone for an installer-led application process to provide support on that. So we're trying to go for a simpler scheme, and finally, perhaps, we've got to be thinking about the sort of the customer journey as well. And again, I'm sure these will be themes that we're returning to during this hearing.
Mr. Rimmington, is there any any lessons that you've learned from the current rollout of the boiler upgrade scheme that you're applying in flight?
Well, we've already learnt some lessons, which were some of the points that David was referring to previously in terms of the amendments that we're making to the scheme. One key lesson that was learnt was the level of the grant, of course, in terms of driving demand. We will continue to evaluate the scheme and the rollout of it and see if there are further refinements we can make to further increase uptake. And
when do you think you will hit the 150 million spend in year?
Mm-hmm. It's something of a crystal ball question. David made clear the numbers in terms of outturn so far. This year we have £150 million in the budget. It's far too early in the year to give you a serious forecast about what we'll hit, but that's the budget, and we'll be heading as close to that as we possibly can. Over the coming Parliament, we then have a further rising trajectory because we have very ambitious rollout targets.
But just the point is, I think it's in the report, but just to really emphasise for those perhaps those watching, is that there have been very encouraging signs from the increase in the uplift in the yes. grant. Applications for the boiler upgrade scheme are 75% higher this February compared to the previous February. So a very significant increase. I accept the point that it's still relatively early days. We need to keep monitoring this closely and not be complacent, but encouraging signs. And I think on the sort of 3-month average or something, it's about 45% uplift compared to the previous period.
Do you think that you'll tip the balance and have consumers who are missing out because the scheme runs out of money, or is?
Well, we've secured an additional £1.5 billion for the boiler upgrade scheme last autumn. So we have secured additional funding. It's a demand-led scheme, and the challenges of managing a demand-led scheme in a budgetary system based on departmental expenditure limits is always a challenge. I'm sure the committee will understand that.
That's the reason behind my question. And finally, a kind of general question. Why is it not that attractive for people to install heat pumps at the moment? Is there more that the department could be doing to promote them?
Well, so two questions. So, first of all, our evaluation from the Renewable Heat Incentive Scheme showed that actually people who get heat pumps, 92% of them were either satisfied or very satisfied. So when people have a heat pump, the experience is a positive one. Evidence is increasingly showing that. Our attitudes tracker work also shows that awareness of heat pumps as a technology is increasing quite quickly, and 20% of people are now saying that when their boiler next needs replacing, they would consider getting a heat pump. So I think we're making progress in that area. There's a fair bit of myth busting that we also need to do about the quality of the consumer experience when living with a heat pump, and various initiatives are in train to speak to that. There's a particularly interesting new initiative by Nesta, which is a visitor heat pump service, where you can log on and find a heat pump that's being used in a property like yours near you, and go and see and talk to the owner of the heat pump, which I think is a really nice kind of learning from how other people are doing this thing kind of initiative. So I can talk about more if you wish, but those are the points.
Thank you. Well, we've got lots of questions about the consumer side of it, because that is obviously a big barrier. But I wanted just to pick up on a strand where I think it was Mr. Pocklington talked about the supply chain and so on, but the opportunities for industry here are actually, I mean, I should say actually thank you to the over 50 organisations and individuals who gave us evidence, so we've got a lot to draw on. But there are opportunities for the supply chain and industry. Are you looking at how you can use this taxpayer injection to make sure that you are building a steady and positive policy that will actually encourage those installers and their manufacturers to invest in the technology?
We absolutely are. That is a key plank of our overall strategy, and I would say also we are starting to see some of the benefits. There's some sort of innovation happening in the sector. There's an important role for government. There is an important role for the private sector here. Can I start with the manufacturers and then perhaps the installers, the two that you mentioned. So, on the manufacturers, obviously it is a global supply chain. But I would note there are some key players already manufacturing in the UK. Mitsubishi, Valent, Ideal already are just examples of people that are manufacturing in the UK. What the government has done is introduced a programme called the Heat Pump Investment Accelerator, which is a competition to secure UK manufacturing of heat pumps. So we've offered up to £30 million, which we've got in our budgets, and our aim is to secure about £200 million worth of investment through that. Process is going well so far. We've received bids. We're currently evaluating those bids at the moment. So
that would be existing manufacturers boosting there, or is this for new?
Existing or new? Existing or new.
Yeah. Have you got any geographical locations that you're?
There's an interesting, and I can't really comment too much on the bids or the process, but there's an interesting selection of bids from in a range of locations.
Will you be evaluating what jobs and wealth into different local areas comes out of that process? If the permanent secretary is looking at you, I guess I am too.
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't quite catch the question.
Sorry, if you're, I mean, I appreciate that if you're at a certain point, you're not going to tell us exactly where these might be at this point. But are you going to be evaluating if a manufacturing plant is boosted or created in a particular area, what job creation is, what jobs are actually created, and
yes,
and what happens to the local economy?
Yes, exactly. So those are very much criteria that we're looking at, and we're going through the due diligence on each of the bids as we speak.
You're funding an evaluation programme for them for this
So we will evaluate the programme, yeah. We're obviously, at the moment, we're in the due diligence process, just assessing the bids, but once we've made determinations on which are successful, then of course we'll evaluate the programme.
Okay, because one of the things about a proper evaluation of this is that we've, as Ms. Blake touched on, there have been other failed or not so effective programmes. Stop-start approaches aren't so good for industry. So if the evaluation is done well, it could actually be an opportunity for the UK business to really invest and grow and create jobs. Absolutely could be. And there are similarities between what we started here and what we're now doing under a different scheme for networks for offshore wind as well, the Giga Fund as well, which some of the committee may have heard of as well. So this is an important, if you like, tool in our armoury that we are very focused on as a department. So that's the manufacturing.
So do installers next, and this is important. So just to give the committee a number, the Heat Pump Association, the trade body, estimate, I think, that we need to train, 30,000 new installers by 2028. So this is a growing industry. Now, there are lots of people working incredibly hard in the gas boiler sector at the moment. So there's a sort of that's the obvious field, but there'll be new people as well wanting to come into this sector. The department is investing £29 million over this Parliament, but to support that's both installers training to work in the heat sector, but also energy efficiency and retrofit as well. But an example of what we're doing, I'd highlight the heat training grant, which is supporting, I think, 3,000 training of 3,000 installers in the first year, 2,000 heat pumps, 1,000 on heat networks, and will support the training of 10,000 installers by 2025.
Does the money go to companies or to FE colleges?
The money flows. I'll
it's £500 is what is given is a discount on the training. So that's what
the individual.
To the individual, yeah.
Okay, so that goes to both companies that are training and education establishments. Yeah.
So it's done through industry, and we spent some time talking to industry about what was the best way, because we've got the challenge is to retrain, perhaps 110,000 gas heating engineers. In order to be, which we've got in this country already, to be able to install heat pumps, and that can be done very quickly. So we engage very closely with industry on the design.
In some cases, it's upskilling or reskilling.
So a lot of it is reskilling, and that can be done relatively quickly. So it's not one of those. Sometimes people think, we've got to train all these people to do something that I've got no experience of. Well, actually, we've got a very skilled workforce already, and it's relatively straightforward to convert that to be able to install heat pumps.
So in terms of where we are, I think our estimate, and the Heat Pump Association agree that we're on track. We're doing what we need to do for 2025, but we need to keep going and keep investing in this space after that. It's a very, very important space. But the other thing I would note is there's a lot of interesting activity in the private sector as well to attract, recruit and retain the installers that we need.
Okay, thank you. Mary Rimmer wanted to come in on this point.
Yes, just on the heat training grant, I was going to ask you what progress has been made. Do you know how many you've got? And where is the training? Is someone checking where the training? Who is carrying out the training? We've had some upsets with successful and unsuccessful trainers, and franchised and things like that.
Yeah, so as Jeremy says, we've in the first year we've trained 3,000 people, and there is budget to at the end of the spending review that would allow us to train 10,000 people. So, and it's been going very well, and we've had good feedback from the companies who have been taking on people who are being retrained, and from individuals who are undertaking the retraining. So far so good on this programme. It's going.
Have you got enough trainers? Yes.
So yes, as Jeremy was saying, we're the Heat Pump Association estimate that we need about 12,000 trained installers by 2025, and so we've already got 7,000. We've just trained 3,000. We've got places for up to 10,000. So in the kind of medium term out to 2025, I think we're in a good place. This is an issue we've got to kind of stay on, but we are on it, and I think we're good on the kind of 2025 time frame. And then, of course, decisions after that will be for the next spending review and money available for the heat training grant or other similar training programs.
Are you content you're going to get sufficient to meet the increased demand for these heat pumps in the future?
Yeah, so certainly on the 2025 timetable, I think we're confident. There's more to be done for 2028.
And just on the manufacturing, the chair rose down. The conductors, that's been a problem getting conductors for the manufacturing. Has that been resolved? Can we do anything? Is the supply chain good enough to meet the manufacturing's needs, the timing and everything?
Yeah, so you're right. Semiconductors has been an issue. I mean, it is one of those. It's also dependent on what is going on in economies around us. So, where there were 1 or 2 years back of a kind of strong increase in continental Europe for heat pumps, then supply chains started to get stretched, that level of increase wasn't seen last year, so it gave the supply chain time to catch up. But it is one of the reasons why we're doing the heat pump investment accelerator, is to build a domestic capacity, which means that we're obviously less dependent on other markets than we are if we are manufacturing a higher proportion of them here.
Okay. I'll bring you back later, Ms. Rimmer. Thank you very much. So with everything, I just want to move on a bit to the consumer. I mean, we know that even though with 60% of the cost being covered, as you've highlighted, I think one of you mentioned earlier that there's some myths around that there's challenges, but we as a committee have looked at this before. There are lots of buildings where it's very challenging to put heat pumps in, so there are still some barriers. How are you trying to overcome those barriers for the consumer?
Yeah, shall I start with that? I do think you have to start with cost, because that is the key issue. And look, we know a new gas boiler, £2,500 to £3,000. An air sourced heat pump without any support from government, it's £8,000 to £15,000. So a wider range, depends what work needs to be done in the home. There needs to be a thermal heat source. Do radiators need to change? Those sorts of issues. But an average for a 3-bedroom house on the gas grid, just over £11,500, maybe £11,600. That is the sort of the key factor, I think. What are we doing? Well, we've increased the support offered through the boiler upgrade scheme, £7,500. That does mean that there are, you can read about this in the newspapers, where there are now people in the right property that are getting an air source heat pump for £500 or very, very, very cheaply indeed. But they're in a minority. Most people will still need to pay more than that. But comparing air source heat pump with boiler upgrade scheme compared to fossil fuel boiler, the difference is now quite small. We're paying maybe over 80%, 85%, I think, roughly of the difference between the two. So there is a lot of support on the capital cost. The other issue is the running cost, though, that I just need to need to mention that, because that is a key issue, and this is obviously because electricity is more expensive than gas. Electricity per unit, current price cap, is about 4 times more expensive than gas. It's what those people in the business call the spark spread. Now, to an extent, that is offset by the fact that heat pumps are 3 times as efficient as gas boilers, so that helps a lot. And there are examples where it can be cheaper to run an air-sourced heat pump if it's absolutely optimised, it's the right property. And also, just the other thing I would note is there's some interesting innovation happening in the sector around tariffs that are being offered that are going some way to start to sort of guarantee the fact that you'll be better off with a heat pump. Early days on that, I don't want to overstate that, but we're watching that closely. It's the sort of thing we want to see. But it does mean that often it can be more expensive to run. Gets us into sort of the difficult question of rebalancing. What can you do to address this? Some of this is sort of some of the difference between electricity and gas, big structural issues in the sector, but there are questions around rebalancing, around how government issues its levies. The government set out last year its intention to look at this issue, and that's what we're doing at the moment. We haven't taken a decision on this, but we're looking very much at our options and what is fair and what is affordable for consumers and taxpayers, really, as we do.
Well, I mean, we know it's always a difficult balance because we want to see the decarbonisation, but the taxpayer's got to get that balance. But there is also, what you've just described is a very complicated picture for consumers. And I know other colleagues will be picking some of this up, but it gets quite headache-making for somebody who's trying to make this decision. And then you add in what Ms Blake raised about not necessarily having to have the cavity wall installation and loft installation in beforehand. So that can affect the running costs. And how is someone expected to understand the running costs of a heat pump if they put it in before installation's put in, after installation's put in, depending on the type of property? You know, there are a lot of variables. How
transparency around that? Can I bring in Mr. Rimmington on this issue? It's something we're
Mr. Rimmington.
Yeah.
Very conscious of this, and both the question about what will my running costs be and those kind of calculations, and working your way through the process, have both issues of complication and complexity for consumers at the moment. So on the question of running costs, what will overall lifetime costs be, there are an increasing number of really good offerings from digital companies which will calculate that and really help you through it. Many of them will link you then through to installation solutions and financing solutions. What we're working on is to make the government digital offering in this space much better as well. And we've already taken some steps.
You said the government digital, so you mean...
Sorry, on Gov.uk, forgive me.
Oh, okay, so that we could look on Gov.uk and some of those companies you'd signpost us to, and you'd have done some assessment that their work was accurate.
On Gov.uk at the moment, we have an enhanced service to help you find ways of progressing the decarbonisation journey for your property, find ways to save energy in my home, it's called. And we also have a simplified means of accessing government support, accessing different types of government grant. We're looking at enhancing all of that further to bring it into one place so you can put the information about your property, and all the questions will be answered in terms of both options and places to go and sources of support. That's not in place yet. It's something that we're working through discovery at the moment, but we know it's a place where there's a role for government to do more, so that's why we're taking that.
But you're trying to get basically a trusted portal that
well,
we can go and check and have some confidence that we're not... Look, there have been snake oil salesmen in this area over, in different areas of insulation and home zero or whatever, over the years. The people who come in and do fake cavity walls. And, I mean, there's cowboys out there. So how are we going to make sure the consumer knows they're getting proper information that they can really make investment decisions on and know about the running costs? You think Gov.uk is going to be it?
We're very conscious of the importance of government's role in this.
Exactly.
So the attitude trackers show that after your heating technician, the next place you would look to go on average would be government advice these days via the internet. So that's why it's really important that we work to get that right. Whenever we do any government programme, we are very clear about making sure we have the right standards in place in terms of the people who must access it. So David can tell you more about under the boiler upgrade scheme, the approach to take to that, but we do that on all our schemes going forward. There is a trade-off just to balance between that level of assurance of quality and not putting more barriers in the way in terms of the customer jury and impeding demand. But we're absolutely cited on that as a key challenge, yes.
So, Mr. Camp, how are you going to make sure that you keep the cowboys out and
Yeah. Could I just add? Because, we do, under the boiler upgrade scheme, we do require the microgeneration certification scheme, who are the body that ensures that installers are doing what they're supposed to be doing. So we require that for all the installations under the boiler upgrade scheme. And
does that mean there's a sort of a sampling of inspections?
Yeah. So they, in fact, they are phoning up consumers afterwards to check that the experience has been as it should have been. But they also ensure that installers, and in answer to your question, that installers provide an accurate assessment of running costs as part of the consumer decision to go ahead. So the consumer will have a heat loss survey that will estimate their running costs, and then the consumer can decide whether they want to go ahead or not. And these are all things that the MCS guarantee.
It sounds like things are improving, but it's still quite confusing, isn't it, really? So there is still a messaging issue here. I'm going to bring in Mr. Lake, and then I've got...
Thank you. Just on that particular point, I represent a constituency where over a third of the housing stock is older than 100 years old. It's a rural area also, and so many of them are detached, sort of old cottages and farmsteads. There have been schemes recently to encourage the take-up of air-source heat pumps as a method of heating some of these homes. To your point there, Mr. Capper, in terms of the heat loss surveys and an estimate of running costs. Who checks to see that those surveys themselves are accurate? Because I have, sadly, a number of cases where the estimated costs don't match up to the reality post-installation.
Yeah. So that's the microgeneration certification scheme. So if you have constituents that are concerned about that, then they should refer that to MCS, who should look into it.
And do they have, what sort of powers do they have
to address?
So I mean, they have the sanction to be able to kick the installers off the scheme, and
right.
So if the installers are kicked off the scheme, they're basically outside of the market, because most of the market is funded through or supported through government schemes. So the installer wouldn't be able to install a heat pump with support from the boiler upgrade scheme, for example.
But in terms of the consumer who's received work to their property, at that point, there is no real redress to them.
Yeah. So we and this perhaps points to your point about simplification of the landscape. But we both require MCS, and at present also for the installers to be members of consumer codes. So there's 2 consumer codes in this area, and there are redress. It depends on exactly what's gone wrong, but there is redress through various different mechanisms under those consumer codes, and that's the other place that consumers can go if they are unsatisfied with the installation that they've received.
Sounds like MPs is a crib sheet of where we can refer our
Yeah.
constituents to. I think the final one for me is that really picking back up on what Ms Blake was raising, with this change in rules about not having to do, you can retrofit your loft and cavity wall installation. So are you going to do an evaluation of how many people have actually done that, and I suppose ideally look at whether the different costs of running a heat pump are pre and post in loft and cavity wall installation? Is that something that's planned?
Yeah, so we're obviously going to evaluate the boiler upgrade scheme and do so very carefully. We're looking to do the kind of first interim report on that later this year. I mean, a lot of that data will be before these changes come in, but we are very keen to assess how the effect that changes we have made, such as this one, actually have on people's experience. Because, I mean, as we talked about right up front, I mean, this is it should make the upfront change for people cheaper, because they don't need to install additional insulation if they choose not to. But we want to assess the consumer experience, and we will do that through the evaluation.
Cost terms, they're not having to pay for it all at once, so you can sort of get that. But on the other hand, the running costs could be higher. But you've got also the opportunity to have a proper absolute comparison between heat pump with no insulation, heat pump with insulation, so you can have some real data if you're clever about how you collect, and that's part of the plan of the evaluation, is it? Yeah, but it is also what the installers should be doing under MCS, is that they should be showing consumers these choices. So, but
so
when you have it in real time, though. Yeah. So if you install your heat pump without insulation, and then you do put the insulation in, you can see a direct comparison with the running costs.
Yeah, so after the fact, we can do exactly what you're suggesting, and we can make sure that we evaluate what the impact was on running costs for people who don't do the insulation, as well as people who do the installation. So absolutely, we can do that, and we'll also look to. You get into issues of sample size, but we will try our best to look at what the consumer experience was for people who both chose to go ahead with the installation and people who chose not to.
Also the consumer experience, but the cost as well, and also in terms of publicity and trying to bring people on board to the idea of a heat pump where that's appropriate. This will be real information for people. If someone lives in a Victorian terrace, they paid this much, they got the roof insulation, the bills went down this much, I imagine they would go down, and that's an example for other consumers. Is that something you're going to feed into the digital, to the gov.uk website?
We will definitely take account of all the findings that we do in evaluation when thinking about all the guidance in this space.
Okay. It's such a minefield for the consumer. It's really challenging. I think we're going to cover some more of that. But I'm going to turn to Jonathan.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I just want to look a little bit more at this demand-cost dynamic. I think we've established from earlier questions that most of the heat pumps installed are not fully covered by the boiler upgrade scheme. And perhaps because of that, would it be fair to say that they would be installed by people who may have switched to a heat pump anyway, perhaps more affluent households? What would you say to that?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's really a question of sort of dead weight, really, isn't it? You're asking, would these people have installed a heat pump anyway? Well, the thing two observations. First of all, when we increased the subsidy offered through the boiler upgrade scheme for an air-sourced heat pump from £5,000 to £7,500, we have seen a significant increase in applications through the scheme. I mentioned earlier that there is figures this February are 75% higher than the previous February. That is a big increase for a scheme like this. But there is a question. You rightly raised the question of dead weight, and it is possible you can design schemes in a different way. In a different way, you could link it to income if you wanted, and there are other countries that have these more complicated schemes that are done in that way. But the lesson from everything that my department and its predecessors have done is the need for simplicity. And so we've made a very conscious choice to have a flat rate scheme to do that. And we think the evidence supports that approach, the very significant increase in applications that we've seen.
Okay, so how on that basis, how can it be reasonable to assume that providing subsidies above the equilibrium demand for heat pumps will stimulate demand sufficiently to reduce the installed cost of heat pumps and therefore vindicate public investment in the technology?
Well, I would say a positive outcome in itself is the sort of the impact we're having on emissions and actually sort of people moving to low carbon heating. The second thing that we are doing is we are building a market. That is, I think, the key point that we are seeking to do as a department, and that is about attracting more manufacturers in the UK, training the installers that we are seeing in the UK, having more companies innovating, offering new proposals, new offers to consumers that help build the market. I think government has a very important role here to play. But ultimately, often it will be the private sector, to be an offer from the private sector, somewhere on the web, something with your energy bill, I don't know, that attracts people to do it. And that requires action from us, requires action from the private sector. We're seeing encouraging signs here, but there's definitely further to go. There are new entrants, there are interesting tariffs being offered, but there's further to go.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ginogly. Mary Rimmer, MP.
Yes, if you can just go back to the charts here. To what extent is delaying the clean market mechanism to 2025 reduce the chances of success reaching targets, 600,000, and also the net zero announcement of September 23, phasing out the fossil fuel heating system and off-grid? To what extent has that? What impact?
So,
are you aware of any?
Let me start with the clean heat market mechanism, which is your first question. So that's correct. We did move back the implementation date till April 2025. Government set out. We did move back, as you said, and that was because we wanted to take a pragmatic and proportionate approach that supported families and didn't impose costs that were unnecessary. But what we have done is
we had a negative impact.
We don't foresee a negative impact from that because the target for what is now the first year of the clean heat market mechanism is going to be the same as what was the second year of the original plan. So the target for 2025 is going to be 6%. So we are reverting back to the schedule that we had previously, and also obviously we also have the impact of the increase in the boiler upgrade scheme as well. So it's a sort of subtle shift in the approach that is
Ms. Rimmer.
Yes. Well, I was going to ask, was the 600,000 over-optimistic target? Is it a practical target? It now.
No, we haven't. No, we remain
at that for the first.
So the different. So the 600,000 is for 2028. That is. I mean, that we're still committed to that target. It is demanding, and we'll come on to. I'm sure come on to that. It's a very big increase, but it is achievable. But what we've seen, the combination of what we did in September and subsequent decisions, is we've slightly shifted our approach in order to provide that additional support in the short term through the increase in the boiler upgrade scheme.
There's no doubt that the upfront grant encourages and the increase encourages more. But there were a significant amount in the spike was reapplications, because if you look at them, grant was being paid out and vouchers were being not being used, and reapplication, they got 7,500, can't blame them. Which brings me to also sales. If we look at sales, it's a great pity, and I can't understand why we haven't got mechanism of installations. We've got sales, we like predicting sales would have to 55,168 in 2022, require 11-fold increase from 22 to 28. How is that looking for 23 sales? But more so important, why are we not looking at installations? Why have we no measure of what's been installed? Because if we look at the budget scheme, if we look at the
could you just point us to the page number that you're referring to, so that people can follow?
If you look at the pump sales.
Yeah. So this is the
29.
I think this is the distinction between sales and installations. I think that you're asking.
Exactly.
You're asking about. So it's about the precise data that we collect. And there are obviously challenges in collecting. No one is required to tell the department if they install a heat pump. Is the sort of the essence of the challenge that we have. That would be overly regulatory. But I don't know, Mr. Rimmington, do you want to?
I'll start and see if David wants to add.
On the data challenges.
But so we collect data from a range of sources, essentially.
I understand that.
Yeah, and we give our best estimates on the basis of that data. We're looking about how we can turn it into a more regular data series that we could publish in a way that the committee and others could access. And we're not there yet, but we're looking at it very seriously. We have to take account of the numbers we get from the Heat Pump Association, because at the moment they're a very good source of data in the marketplace to sit alongside what we have from installations that we support under government schemes. The additional factor, two further factors in terms of from our perspective. One, there were of course also significant numbers of installations going on in devolved administrations, which wouldn't come through into our data. And two, there were of course new build installations, which wouldn't always get caught. So it isn't a straightforward statistical job, but we are looking at how we can do something on a more rolling basis.
If we look at installations, which I'm more interested in, I'm sure we all are really, if we could get some proper mechanism, that would be very encouraging. But if we look at the boiler upgrade scheme, the budget was 30,000 for the first year, underspend for 30,000 installations for that year. And the underspend was 100 million. That's on page 20, 19 bracket. And if I look at the F3 chart, that's very useful. It shows it out. We've got the figures down there. There was 637, I think, done under the 673 heat pumps installed in 18 months. And if you look at the eco scheme, there were 14,087. They seem to be the only facts that we've got on installations. But which leads me to, is there any, in the schemes, the budget, do you have any facility, I'm sure, to how frequently is the budget monitoring of the spend? Is there any opportunity or any appetite for varying spend, underspend, to increase the spend more on one thing than another that doesn't detract from the overall achievements? Is that looked at frequently?
Again, I'll start. And you touch on a few points in the question. Yeah. On the underspend, The key challenge there is the demand-led point that Jeremy was making first. And when you set up a new scheme like this, you can't be sure what your level of demand is. And given the development of the market, it has to grow. So David was talking about this as well. That's why we're in the position we're in. We do not via the underspend into the following year, because that is not consistent with standard government.
You can't via an underspend.
It's not the way the budgets are set. The budget is set from year to year. But we do, of course, talk to the Treasury about future funding requirements.
So that 100 million that was underspent that first year, you can't automatically use that in the second year, even though it's overall budgeted.
This is not unusual for the way that government schemes are funded.
Just to be clear, anyone following, this is Treasury rules, but of course it's up to the Department and the Treasury to have a negotiation.
It needs to be agreed
which either would allow a environment, which is unusual, but really realistically would add an extra allocation the following year.
It needs to be agreed.
I would have thought you could put some weight behind that when it's such
needs to be agreed.
It's so important, this target.
Actually, perhaps we should get the Treasury Officer account, Marius Gallagher, just to explain the rules on this, just so that anyone following is understanding.
Well, if there are underspends in one particular year, you can't automatically assume that you can take them forward and spend those underspends the following year. Those rules have been in place for a long time, and it has helped to regulate and to bring discipline to spending.
I can understand needing discipline, and I would expect discipline to apply, but it's worth a chance when it's such an important policy.
Ms Rimmer is making the department's case.
I'm
delighted.
It's very important. It's very important, and the cost and money not being spent. I'm not on about wasting it, throwing it away. It's about value for money, but it's also about value for money for the people out there, and it is very, very important. But if you look at the different schemes that are coming forward, like the social heating, the 673, Eco Company 14,087. But if you look at the budget was applied was 30,000 installations. There were applications for 31,000. Grant paid out to 19,000, and yet there was only 18,000 installed. So it just shows you what figures can be so misleading. Applications, it's great, isn't it? When you look at the spike in the applications, went up to 7,500, a good chunk of that was applications. So it's about knowing what is the truth. I'm not saying you're misleading us deliberately, but it's about knowing actual facts, what is going on the ground, what's the impact of the...
Mr Pocklington.
So I do want to make one very important distinction, which is between those programmes that are funded via taxpayers. That includes the boiler upgrade scheme, it includes the social housing decarbonisation scheme that you made, but also, and on the one hand, and those schemes that are funded by consumers via their energy bills. The energy company obligation is the key one there, the eco scheme. That is a very, very different scheme managed in a different way over multiple years. It doesn't have the same restrictions on where essentially companies are obligated to introduce a certain series of measures. A lot of heat pumps are being installed through the eco scheme. So last year, I think approximately 12,600 heat pumps were installed through the eco scheme as well. So there is the boiler upgrade scheme is very, very important. That is for the able to pay market. You combine that with the clean heat market mechanism to drive change in that market. But for other people, for vulnerable, for those in other households, schemes like the eco scheme are very, very important for the delivery of the mission here.
Could I just also comment on this point about installations versus applications? So we do publish monthly statistics for the boiler upgrade scheme, and we do publish both the application numbers and also the installation numbers under the scheme, so the redemptions as well, where there is an actual application that is redeemed. So we publish both sets of numbers at the same time.
The cost to the public is very, very important. The cost of insulation. You're more inclined to buy if you've got a chunk to pay out. The better off are more inclined to get there first. So it's important, I think, to look at some mechanism to perhaps social housing or to the lower economic.
strongly agree with that, and I think that's what I think I was just trying to sort of start to move on to in my previous answer. We actually have a range of schemes that supports both energy efficiency but also shift to clean heat in social housing and for fuel poor and for those in vulnerable housing. And Mr. Rimmington oversees the wider programme for that. I don't know if you want to just summarise that. Social housing decarbonisation.
I certainly can. Well, the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund is running well and is proving very successful in terms of attracting match funding from social housing providers, which makes the government money, your value point, makes the government money go substantially further. It's more than 100% match funding we're getting into that. And that is rolling out, of course, across through housing associations and councils across social housing right across the country, and has sustained funding at a substantial level through the next spending review period as well. We have the eco scheme that Jeremy was just explaining in addition. We've also had our home upgrade grant focused specifically on low-income households off the gas grid, where we've been also driving that through local authorities. And on top of that, of course, we have help with the cost of living and help with the cost of paying your energy bills, things like the warm home discount and so forth. So we do have a rounded package, speaking to the point that you're making, I think.
Is private rented accommodation ever considered?
Private rented accommodation, where people are in struggling with their fuel bills, they will come within scope of the help, of course, of the warm homes discount if they're in private rented accommodation. Yeah, and you can also get help from via eco in private rented accommodation. Absolutely, yeah, depends on the various criteria.
The other one is communication. It's very important. Selling it to people, and I have to confess, I'd much rather see a face and listen to someone. I'm not more inclined to be bought that way. And the older and perhaps the less fortunate people are not really into IT. They're not really. What consideration is given to communication to those people that need it face to face?
Mr. Rimmington.
So we're very aware of this issue. I was talking before about our government digital offering, and apologies for the jargon, but that is backed up with a helpline. So people who don't want to use a digital way of finding out the answer to their questions about how to heat their home or how to access the grants, we have a national helpline that's available that people can call to get support with that. We've also been piloting some face-to-face advice demonstrator things. We've had 35, I think, projects across the country, which have been specifically trying to get to these hard-to-reach consumers. And looking at things like in working in community centres, going to working with the local charities and so forth, on a range of things from provision of advice to actually going in and giving people whole house retrofit guides. So, like all of this area, it's always a space you could do more, but that's the range of activity that we're undertaking at the moment.
Have you been piloting that across the UK, or have you had particular areas?
It's across England, but it's in all regions of England. We have this range of schemes going on.
And how are you evaluating the effectiveness of that pilot in reaching the people?
They're ongoing until March 25, yep. And then we'll be evaluating it and considering absolutely what we want to do on a more ongoing basis.
I think you might have a bunch of people, MPs, bidding for face-to-face in their local community hall. I think that Ms. Rimmer, to you.
I think that's
okay. That's for now. Thank you, Will. Ben Lake MP.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, gentlemen. Forgive me, I'm having a little bit of difficulty grasping the progress or otherwise made against the 600,000 installation target for 2028. You've mentioned already that the inavailability of data on actual installations, and I think if I've understood things correctly, we have a clear idea of the number of installations that have been made through various government schemes, but we then depend on sales data for those that might have been installed privately. Do we have any idea as to how close or otherwise the proxy of sales is to the reality? How confident are we that it offers a useful proxy?
I think it is a useful. I would say it is a useful mechanism. So 60,000 sales last year. We know from the micro certification generation scheme that installers accredited by them installed about 40,000, but they don't install. Not everyone who installs a heat pump is certified by the micro generation scheme. So that gives you a sort of boundary, and we think it's closer to 60,000, but we don't have an absolutely precise number. But I mean, we're the first. There's obviously still a long way to go to 600,000, even if it is 60,000 or closer to that.
And then just then, in terms of the target for 600,000 a year, that includes all installations, no matter how they're funded, where they're funded, whether it's in
UK-wide, all installations 2028.
All right. And in that case then, how confident are we that we're going to hit that 600,000 target? What is the plan? Because as you've mentioned there's over a tenfold. If 2023 we had 60,000, that's a 5,000 increase on 2022, which is welcome, but at that rate, we're not really going to. It's actually a smaller increase than between 2021 and 2022 if we look at sales.
We think it's achievable. We do think it's demanding. We're not telling the committee otherwise. I'm not going to repeat everything that I've already said so far about what we're doing for the able-to-pay market and for the vulnerable. But what are the things we haven't covered so far that are also going to help us reach the target? I think probably the bigger item here to mention is the Future Home Standard, which my former department, DLUC, leads on. That is mandating low-carbon heating for new build properties, and that we're on track to introduce that in 2025. We think that will make a very big difference, because that is roughly 200,000 new build properties a year. The vast majority of those, heat pump will be the appropriate technology for clean heating. So that will also make a difference. So. We also talked about all the things we're doing to support the sector, and noted the innovation that's happening in the sector as well. So there's a lot that we're doing. If I just offer two further observations. First of all, I said it's demanding. We might need further policy in the next Parliament. There'll be future spending reviews. We haven't got all our budget allocations to 2028, just for example. Just the other thing I would say, and looking back at history, this sort of thing, is when sectors change, when markets change, they can, I'm not saying they will, but they can change quickly. If you look back at the history of the transition to condensing boilers, it's a similar pattern of a number of years getting going, and then eventually it changed quite quickly. So I'm not complacent about it. I don't want to understate the challenge here, but it's right that we continue to drive forward progress towards that target.
Very briefly, if I may, thank you. That's very, very useful. And if we take as granted then, as given, that once the Future Home Standard kicks in 2025, that'll take 200,000 or thereabouts installations from the target. We're still looking at 400,000 against, at the moment, last year I think you said it's 60,000 sales. Appreciating that we're only one quarter into 2024, but are the number of sales and installations aligning with what you would hope to see if we are to hit the 2028 target? Because it does seem to me as though we haven't got much time to see that spike.
No, and for 2020, for 2020, it's still quite early days at the moment. I think we'll get another month's data, I think, in the coming days, actually. Right. So it's a little bit early in the year, but I would come back to the very significant increase that we've seen in the boiler upgrade scheme. And then you do have to think, well, what will be the impact of the clean heat market mechanism next year as well? As we've covered that, and we've covered that as well in the hearing. So we are continuing to look at this closely.
And then in that case, very finally, then, just in terms of at what point would it be this year, perhaps next year, if the anticipated increase doesn't materialise? At what point, in view of the 2028 target, would you go to ministers and government saying, look, we need further interventions, we need other policy? Because again, we are running out of time.
It'd be an ongoing review. I don't think I want to put a single moment on it. I think we keep this ongoing review through the department's governance, as you would as you would expect, at a sort of programme level, monthly, departmental level, essentially quarterly. We'll be continuing to monitor and oversee this as the committee would expect. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lake. You talked about you used the example then, Mr. Pocklington, the condensing boilers and how the market can take off. But when we've looked at this before and nothing really has changed, there are things like blocks of flats, certain types of properties, which is just physically difficult to install heat pumps. And you figure 3, as Ms. Rim has referred to, has the hydrogen heating programme in it. There are other options being explored. What progress is being made on those, and what percentage of properties do you think ultimately? I know you've got your targets for 2028 and so on, but there will be a percentage of properties that will never really be able to have heat pumps. What do you do about that?
Absolutely right. We do think for the majority, the significant majority of properties, heat pumps would be an appropriate technology. I think we've estimated that now at about 80%. It may actually be higher than.
Which could just in your calculations, which are the types of properties or regions where this might be harder?
So then you come into where it is going to be more challenging. Dense urban areas, I think, will be the most challenging area in terms of heat pumps. The density, the lack of the outside space, obviously people living in flats. Obviously, would be a key.
So in my constituency, more people live in flats than anything else.
I'm acutely aware that in Hackney and in Westminster as well. Will need to be other technologies. Heat networks would be the next major technology. There are other technologies as well that we can come on to, but heat networks is, I think, the other thing that we should focus on initially. We'll come on to hydrogen as well at some stage, I'm sure. First thing to say is we've taken significant steps to build the market and build the regulatory oversight we're going to need over heat networks. The Energy Act last year is giving us the powers to regulate heat networks and introduce heat network zoning for when it's required. The second thing to say is we're also investing considerable funding in heat networks as well. It's the other part of Mr. Capper's role, as well as heat pumps. In this spending review, I think it's 338 million we've invested in our support for heat networks. Between 2025 and 2028, we're investing 530 million in heat networks.
When you say investing in this, what's the money going to?
The key live fund at the moment is the Green Heat Network Fund is the key thing, and I think so far we're providing grants of 268 million to support 20 projects, and there's another round of that opening later this year. So that is the key vehicle.
You've only spent 47% of that, haven't you?
There was quite a lot of catch-up, I think, on heat networks towards the end of the year after the report was published. I don't know if Mr. Capper has.
So we spent over 90% of the budget for the Green Heat Network Fund by the end of the year. Yeah.
And it wasn't a rushed to get it out the door spend.
No, it was expected that there would be but we've been in a process of catching up after the first year, and then this was the second year with the scheme, and we're expecting. We've got a very strong pipeline of projects for heat networks, and we might have the problem that you were alluding to, which would be a nice problem to have on the boiler upgrade scheme of us, potentially running out of budget. Then on heat networks, we're more in that kind of space where there's a really strong pipeline of projects, and we're looking. Looking to, which is why we've allocated even more money for the years 25 to 28.
Just walk it through for people because a lot of people on heat networks. There's been an issue about the bills and access to some of the subsidies from government on support for those. So if someone's, I should declare I live in a block of flats, but if someone's a typical Hackney flat dweller, or council or housing association or private, and a lot around the country, Cardiff, Manchester, other places have similar high rises. So you've got flats, you've got a shared heat network, so there are disadvantages at the moment. If you're a leaseholder or a tenant, are there any particular impacts on you financially of this, or will the Green Heat Network Fund cover the costs?
So affordability is a kind of key criterion under the Green Heat Network Fund in order to be able to provide the funding. There's there's kind of different parts of your question, because we have been providing support through the energy bills discount scheme to consumers who are on heat networks, and that is we're at the kind of tail end of that, but there's been about 13,000 applications for that, with consumers benefiting broadly to the tune of £1,200 per consumer from that support over the last year or two. But the main way on heat networks in future is, as Jeremy was saying, that we, in the Energy Act, we introduced the regulatory framework for heat networks, with Ofgem to become the regulator. And this is something that is really important, ensuring that there's fair pricing and quality of service, and the things that mains, gas and electricity consumers have come to expect. Those should be true for heat networks as well, and that's why we're bringing in the regulatory framework.
So just to draw it right back to the individual. So you've got an individual. So they quite often, if you think about what has happened to leaseholders, for example. I am a leaseholder, but that's not talking about myself. But leaseholders often had cladding, other material defects of properties. They've had heat network issues, service charge issues, insurance issues. There's an awful lot going on if you're a leaseholder. And what you're saying, really, just to be clear to people, is that there's no additional burden to green their heat network if they've already got one.
Yeah, so certainly the projects coming through the Green Heat Network Fund, then the fair price for consumers is absolutely critical, and we will ensure that there's fair pricing through the Ofgem regulatory framework, which is why we're appointing them as the regulator.
Okay, and then I just wanted to touch on getting this clean heat to market. So we've got to decarbonise the power sector. We looked at that plan by the department to do it by 2035. We think that's a big challenge. I think we would all acknowledge it's a challenge. And all of the heat pumps will be using electricity rather than gas. Yep. There's going to be huge more demand. So how far on track are you? And really, let's be honest, Mr. Pocklington, what are the challenges now getting that clean heat to market, so that there's going to be enough green electricity to cover the demand for green heating?
Look, it's a very important question, and we looked at this at our previous hearing on this issue. What we do in the department actually is we start, when we think about the power sector, with demand, and we want to take into account what the impact will be of demand, of electrification of heat, of increasing use of electric vehicles as well. We then actually looked at a range of scenarios, depending on we don't know exactly what will happen. Again, we may touch on hydrogen as well at some stage. So we look at a range of demand scenarios, and we need to make sure we have a plan to meet generation the needs in those different scenarios. I won't summarise everything that we are talking about, but two things perhaps just to highlight in this context is the importance of looking at what's happening within each day. Heat pumps may change the patterns around that, and we need to make sure we have a system that can manage peaks and troughs throughout the day. That's probably what the Smart Meters programme is designed, that we touched on previously, is designed to enable. The second issue I would highlight is the important role of the distribution network operators, so-called the DNOs, who run the system. At the end of the chain, you've got the transmission operators running the big grid, like the national grid, and then the DNOs run the regions where it actually connects you to your individual home. And actually that's where we've got work underway. The National Infrastructure Commission are looking at this issue of how we build capacity in the DNOs so they can manage the increase the demand, not at the national level, big plans, but actually on the street level as well.
So, are you also engaging local authorities and the larger landlords in that?
Yeah. So that's another really important aspect to this. Actually, the energy system category, I was up there only a few weeks ago, are doing some work at the moment, working closely with local authorities on local energy plans, and that is looking at a whole range of issues, heat networks as well, ultimately things like industrial decarbonisation as well, perhaps some retrofit as well, how we handle things like on-street parking for EVs, but also some of these questions around how you actually really start to think about the demand at a local level as well. That's an evolving picture. There's a lot further to develop on those. But it's a really sort of interesting development.
It's interesting, but it's also hugely challenging, isn't it? Because you could end up with very big needs in areas where, let's say, you need a car to get around, so you have an electric vehicle, you've got some of the other demands on the grid. How are you matching your planning for the grid? Because we know that's a big infrastructure project in its own right, regardless of any changes, and let alone any.
It is a big issue. I'm sort of almost opening up a whole another hearing of issues there. So national system planning. I think the other thing I would add, because we're talking more about the local level, is Ofgem have started work looking at regional system planning as well, to look at those areas where we think there will be particular high levels of demand.
Thinking in West London, it's hard to build housing.
That's the classic example
should
that people are.
Explain that just so people who might not.
So a lot of people know in West London, I think National Power Network are the UK Power Network are the distribution network operator in that area, and there have been some issues with getting connections in West London. For new housing, I think, is a sort of the example that's often given as well, just because of the constraints of the
data processing
the system, because there's more demand coming in from others as well. So regional system planning will help, but it's also about having a system that is sufficiently flexible, that is able to manage this and demand and sort of shift demand at different times of the day. And to have some demand side response. Now, this is not telling people you can't do things at a certain time of day, but it's about using automation, digitisation wherever possible in order to optimise the system locally.
Thank you. Olivia Blake, MP.
Thank you, Chair. I was a member of the Bill Committee that looked at the Energy Act, and I was just wondering what indications there are that the changes in the Energy Act are helping to enable heat networks, and if you don't know yet, when you will know what impact that legislation is having.
Mr. Capron, this is sort of implementation, as it were, of the Energy Act.
Yeah. So, I mean, there are two parts to it for heat networks. One's the regulatory framework, which we've touched on already, where we're working with Ofgem. We've already consulted on the consumer protections that will be needed. That consultation just closed in February, and we're looking at the responses to that now. And then on heat network zoning, which was the other main part of the provisions in the Energy Act, then again we've consulted on that, and we're looking to bring forward the government response and the secondary legislation that's needed to allow local authorities to start designating zones later this year.
Can I ask a bit about emerging technologies that could help green heat networks, and if you see any of them on the horizon, or what a green heat network what technology would that use at the moment? Because a lot of them are district heating networks that burn rubbish, for example, or they're gas powered. So what does a green heat network look like? Yeah, so
a lot of the applications that we're getting under the Green Heat Network Fund are essentially for large heat pumps. So it's you have a single or two maybe really big heat pumps that then servicing a range of buildings within a heat network. But that is not the only source. I mean, energy from waste that you've mentioned, there's a fair number of schemes for energy from waste at the moment. We are seeing other sources of heat. So there's mine water in Gateshead. We've got a heat network in Gateshead that uses mine water. We've announced a heat network in Cornwall, which is based on geothermal. So there are a range of other sources of heat other than just large heat pumps. And I mean, it was one of the things that we've consulted on in the consultation on heat network zoning is sources of heat within or adjacent to a heat network zone required to commit to connect to the heat network, so to provide heat into the heat network. And And it is one of the things, I mean, from international learning, I mean, the Danes are right out there in front on heat networks, and one of the things that they found is when they put these kind of requirements in place that you get a lot of different sources of heat looking to be able to join the heat network, and some of them are kind of more unexpected than you would think, because you've got waste heat from industrial processes, from power stations and so on. And so that's one of the things we've consulted on, and the heat network zoning, to try and get a range of heat sources, including waste heat, into heat network zones.
So in Sheffield, for example, we have a very large district heating network, which not only does households but also businesses and hospitals and public buildings in the city. At the moment, that's powered by waste. How would you support a big monolithic kind of heat system like that to go green, and would they be eligible for some of the grants that you've kind of been describing?
Yeah, so the Green Heat Network Fund is available both for new schemes but also for retrofitting existing schemes. I mean, at the moment, we've got about 3% of heat is supplied to buildings through heat networks, but there's potential to expand that to around 20%. So whilst you'd expect the kind of balance to be in kind of new schemes, then the money in the Green Heat Network Fund is definitely available for retrofitting existing schemes where they're currently using fossil fuels. I mean, most of them are using CHP, so gas-based at the moment. But the money is available to convert to clean sources like the ones I've talked about, including large heat pumps.
Thank you very much, Ms Blake. Peter Grant, MP.
Thank you, Chair. And can I apologise to the witnesses? I had to nip out for a few minutes. I've got a couple of other select committees on this afternoon, one of which was in danger of losing its quorum. And I'm grateful to colleagues on the committee for allowing me to get away for a wee while. Mr Pocklington, I want to talk first of all about engagement with the public and all of this. I'll come on to some specific projects in a minute, but to begin with, why is it you haven't already established a UK-wide public engagement plan just to make sure people understand why we need to do this and why we need to start doing it now?
Yeah, so we've touched a little bit on this, if I can, just in your absence, Mr. Grant. But just to sort of summarise what we have done, we've actually done a lot to set out, provide information to the public. I'd sort of highlight in particular the Welcome Home to Energy Efficiency campaign. It's a very significant budget to do that. That opens up for further tools that provide support and advice to people in terms of
Mr. Grant
for how you can improve energy efficiency in your home. And we're now our focus now is developing an additional tool to enable people to have further detailed, more specific advice on what they can do to improve their home. That's in the digital discovery phase, the heat tool. That has been our focus to date, and that's the choice that we've made. We're not underplaying the importance of consumer engagement, but we're trying to sort of prioritise what we think is the right thing to do next. I'm obviously aware of the recommendation in the NAO in the report to do more and to have a sort of full, even bigger consumer engagement campaign than we've done so far.
Well, we've got people, and I suspect most members of the committee will have been lobbied by some of them since this inquiry was announced. I certainly have. We've got people who either openly or covertly are representing very, very big financial vested interests who see it as a job to tell people that climate change doesn't exist, that net zero is a waste of time, that the oil and gas are going to be there forever. If the general public believe that, then we are in trouble. So what specifically has your department or the government generally done to recognise the threat that this misinformation creates and to be prepared to tackle it on a scale that, frankly, so far, encouraging people or showing them how they can cut their energy bills is not where it's at. This is not about the cost of energy. This is about the possibility that energy won't be there if we don't find alternatives.
So I think the importance of providing clear information is absolutely the heart of what my department does, both on the importance of tackling net zero and actually delivering the department's overall strategy, our ambitious plans that we have to deliver our carbon budgets. But then also, I think you need to think about it a little bit differently when you're thinking about supporting consumers make individual decisions that affect their affect their lives and affect their homes. That's where you need to provide more targeted, I think, specific support on the choices that they have and the benefits that they can see from making change. That's what we've done. I'm not saying there isn't more that we could that could be done in this space, but I think the department has already done an awful lot.
If we look at some specific examples, the 2 hydrogen village projects were abandoned. In one, the government were quite clear that it was largely because the residents in the area concerned just refused to have anything to do with it. In the other, although a different reason was given, there was also very significant public resistance. At the same time, H100 in Meth on my constituency, thanks to a very, very careful and well-resourced public engagement programme, if anything, the biggest problem we've got now is people outside the pilot area asking why they're not allowed to be involved. How can some players in the field get their public engagement so right and others get it so wrong that the entire project has to be abandoned as a result?
So we're following closely it's the H100 trial, isn't it, that you're referring to, which I know is in your constituency, and the work of Scotland Gas Network to help manage that and bring consumers with us. I think it's a really important thing to be done. Just on the village trials, you referred to Whitby, where there was. Well, no, there was opposition. The issue with the other trial, the other proposed area, and I think we were only planning to do one, they were the final 2, was in Redcar. So ultimately, we didn't have the hydrogen source that we needed, so we weren't able to proceed with that one, although we've still got a lot of evidence from that. But you're right, the importance of bringing consumers with us, particularly on some of these key issues like safety, is key. What are we doing? Well, as part of our work towards the 2026 decision, we're working very, very closely with the Health and Safety Executive on this issue, because ultimately it's the HSE that will be, the regulators that will be trusted, making sure that there is a proper evidence base around the safety and appropriateness of hydrogen and what mitigations will be needed to ensure that it is safe.
How did you get into the position where you had so much dependent on the project at Redcar and then discovered that they didn't have a reliable source of hydrogen? What went wrong in the selection?
Ultimately, look, we still have to look after value for money. We still have to protect the.
It's a simple question. How do you get that?
The issue is the proposed hydrogen project for that trial was one of the candidates that applied for what we call the HAR1 scheme, which was the sort of the hydrogen allocation round 1 scheme. And in our evaluation of those proposals, we took account of the strategic value of that project, but ultimately the judgment that we made was that the benefits didn't outweigh the core value for money considerations around the economic terms around that project. So that's what happened, and that we've explained and we've set out as a
Mr.
department.
Pocklington, I'm still trying to understand. It's the equivalent of a key vacancy being filled in an organisation, and you quickly find yourself in a position where there's only one candidate left and they don't meet the minimum criteria to be appointed. So how did the Redcar project get so far so that it became literally the last project standing without there being a reliable and proven supply of the hydrogen that was necessary for it to
Well, it's important, but I think the other thing that we're taking into account as the department is we have got other sources of evidence as well. So yes, our plan was to look at the outcomes of the village trials, but it's not our only source of it. It's not the only thing that we are reliant on.
You're moving off from the very question Mr. Grant is asking, which is about why the village programme ran into the sands like this. So whatever else you're doing, can we just keep back to the village programme?
I think it's material to the answer, because ultimately what the department decided was that there were other sources of way of getting the evidence that we needed in order to make decisions around the role of hydrogen. That's what I'm saying. We've discussed what the the position was with the two candidates for that trial, the Whitby proposal. There was strong local opposition. Ultimately, ministers decided it was not appropriate to proceed. That's well known. And the red card proposal was the other proposal. There we have ultimately the project wasn't viable because that's connected to the source of hydrogen.
Have you learned or sought to learn any lessons from SGN and the partners about good practice engagement with this?
We're working very closely with SGN and following very closely what's happening with their trial in Fife, because that is looking at some of these key questions around consumer acceptability of hydrogen and what it is that customers not just to be safe but to feel safe with that fuel source.
Thank you. And obviously, I've got a very keen constituency interest in the hydrogen pilot, but we're in a situation, aren't we, where if we want to be delivering carbon-free energy sources to people's homes, at the moment we've got electricity produced by sustainable methods, and we've got the possibility of hydrogen. And that's about it, isn't it? Is there any other source of fuel that we're looking at?
They're going to be they're the two majorities. There are other things at the margin, hydro-treated vegetable, things like that. But I don't want that's almost a distraction. They're the big players.
Okay, so we're going to have to rely on hydrogen to some extent. We're not going to fix it all by doing cleverer things with electricity, even within the time that it might take to develop some of the other technologies that you've mentioned. We now have the smallest scale pilot, H100, which has been delayed a bit but is still making good progress. That's exclusively for supply to the domestic market. Part of the intention with the hydrogen villages and the hydrogen towns was to take that a step further and look at what happens when we try to fuel non-domestic premises at the same time. Hydrogen villages have gone, they've both been cancelled. Hydrogen towns were now 13 months past the date of an announcement as to a successful bidder. When can we expect an announcement on that?
The department's considering the next steps on the hydrogen town trial, and we'll set out our plans shortly. I can't give you a precise date because I know that's always the follow-up.
Can you give a window of time?
But it's relatively soon. It's coming up. I hope before summer, for example. So, but I can't give you a precise.
No, we understand there may be things that get in the way, but you're hoping before the summer. That's so reasonably soon. Okay, thank you, Mr. Grant.
You still expect him in a position to come to an overall decision in 2026?
Yes,
and by that time there won't actually have been a live trial of hydrogen supply to non-domestic premises by then, will there? Because it's too late for the hydrogen towns to have done that. What evidence are you going to base it on if you don't have evidence in the field from a...
Good question. So I think there are two things. First of all, I do think it's important that it's important to understand what the government position is currently on the use of hydrogen. But yes, we are still working towards a strategic decision on the future of heating in 2026. That's what we set out in 2021. That remains unchanged. We did set out last year, in response to the Committee on Climate Change, that we expect heat pumps to be the primary means of decarbonising heating in the near term. Anyone looking to install a heat pump should do so irrespective of where they live. And then we said that hydrogen could play a role in slower time in some locations. So that was the position we set out then, and we're working towards thinking about what those use cases might be. What building types, what areas, what locations, for example, near blue hydrogen production. So that's production and sort of CCUS, carbon capture clusters. We have got a lot of evidence that we are collating as part of that. You mentioned the trial in Fife. There are also trials in other countries that are interesting as well that will be very relevant. The Netherlands and Germany are examples of that. We've learnt a lot from our experience in Redcar. There's a programme of work underway with the Health and Safety Executive. I think the issue of safety we know will be absolutely crucial here. What's the evidence that we need as well? And then there's a lot of modelling as well that we are doing, because ultimately there'll be a lot of decisions to be taken around that in-house. We also will be working with the National Energy System Operator, NESO, on that. I would note that, of course, the National Infrastructure Commission, you will know this, have essentially recommended that we don't use hydrogen and that we do move to electrification for heat, and essentially using heat pumps. So they're further ahead of where the government decision is. But there's work underway. We're continuing to work towards that decision. You rightly observed, Mr. Grant, in your question, that electrifying heat for all parts of the country will require us to reinforce the network. It'll lead to some big challenges on that front as well. So these are important decisions.
Just for clarification, and maybe for the benefit of those watching at home, I do sometimes get concerned. It looks as if we're suggesting that hydrogen and heat pumps are alternative solutions. They're not. The heat pump is a machine that turns energy into heat, or that uses energy to get heat. How does the heat pump operate? Are we assuming that heat pumps will all be electrically operated?
Yeah, mainly, vast majority will be air-sourced heat pumps, 90-something%, I think, but there may be some other ground-source heat pumps as well. There are other potential but I think they're not mutually exclusive, though. That's, I think, your key point is it's not a choice of using electrification or hydrogen. There may well. The question is, what's the combination of the two?
But the question is that the heat pump needs electricity to make it go. I mean, yes. The simplest explanation of a heat pump is it's an inside-out fridge.
Yes, exactly.
Effectively, and the fridge doesn't work without electricity.
Yes.
So the strategy of relying heavily on heat pumps, even given the questions that have been raised earlier, there's a lot of domestic properties in the UK that are never going to be suitable for a heat pump. There's a lot of them that don't have access to the electricity grid, for example. That in its own...
Very few. There's 15% or so that don't have access to the gas grid, but there are very few that don't have access to the electricity grid.
Yeah. The question might be whether they have access and the capacity that they're going to need. The problem with most, in fact, all renewable sources, genuine renewable sources of electricity, is that the electricity is produced when nature decides to produce it, when the wind blows it, when the sun shines. Is it not the case that we're always going to need some way of storing?
Yes. Sorry, I understand the question now. So this is going back up to look at the electricity sector as a whole and how we generate electricity. I agree. Low carbon, flexible sources of generation will be important to help us manage a grid that is very reliant on a lot of renewables, particularly offshore wind and solar. But and they are the big and the big technologies will be carbon capture, hydrogen to power, and long duration storage as well. The department is development. This is a big focus of the department, is developing these areas. The shorter term level things like batteries also matter, but these are sort of scale long term to get us through the winter months. We are going to need those technologies.
Given the delay in the announcement about hydrogen towns, the abandonment of the hydrogen villages, and looking at the uncertainty facing the market in some other, I suppose, niche sectors, for example, at Westfield, another side of my constituency, I've got Melton Renewables, who have a power station that uses chicken litter, which means that they're effectively taking the waste product from about half of poultry farming in Scotland and turning it from a pollution problem into an asset that can produce energy. They still don't know what government policies are going to be in place when they want to start investing significant investment to keep Westfield and some of the other stations open. Do you understand the concerns among particularly some of the small to medium-sized producers who are going to be an important part of the overall picture, and also among some potential customers, that on so many fronts the government seems to be delaying decisions, putting back decisions, slowing down the pace of decisions being taken, and an increasing number of businesses are getting close to the critical point where they need to take investment decisions, and if they don't know what the government position is going to be, then the investment decisions are likely to be unfavourable. Is your department aware of that, and are you in discussions with the Department for Business and Trade to make sure that we don't start to lose the technological advantages we have in some of this new technology simply by discouraging businesses from continuing to invest?
We work very closely with the Department for Business and Trade. I don't accept that there are, to use your phrase, so many things that we are sort of slowing down. Actually, what my department is doing is continuing to focus to deliver its ambitious plans to maintain energy security and achieve net zero. Now, we need to take decisions in the right order at the right time. The department's view is that it remains the case that this crucial strategic decision should be taken in 2026. We think is around the right time to do that. That was what we set out in 2021. We're still working towards taking that decision on that timescale. Now, we are learning things all the time, and there is a risk if you take decisions ahead of the appropriate time that you may actually lock yourself into a sort of suboptimal path. So we need to take the appropriate decisions at the right timescale, taking into account of investment cycles, yes, absolutely, in order to make sure that we're attractive for the investment that we need.
Thank you, Mr. Grant. Thank you. Jonathan Shinogli, MP.
Thank you. I'd just like to look at this from the consumer perspective, if I may. So Worcester, Bosch and Baxi are already producing hydrogen-ready boilers at the same cost to the consumer as a methane combi boiler. To convert to hydrogen, a £25 part is installed, which can be done by any gas-safe fitter at an annual service in under 15 minutes. So would it be fair to say that hydrogen is consumer cost-friendly?
Mr. Kaplan?
Yeah, so I mean, you've got to look at the overall cost of the system rather than just the cost of the heating appliance.
I'm looking at it to the cost of the consumer.
Yeah,
we know production costs.
But the cost of the cost of the consumer isn't just the cost of the appliance. Yeah. It's going to be the cost of the fuel. It's going to be the cost of the system that sits behind that, so the networks that would be needed for that. I mean, there's a whole range of system costs that need to be considered when you're comparing the cost that the consumer will face, and this is why we've said we want to take the decision in 2026 on hydrogen, is to allow us to properly assess these costs. We've had cost estimates from the National Infrastructure Commission. I mean, they've said that hydrogen as a system would be at somewhere 11 to 16% more expensive for consumers than a fully electric system. But yeah, that's based on one set of analysis, and we're keen, through the evidence that we're gathering, on actually how you would deploy hydrogen, and what you would need to do to make it safe, what you would need to do in terms of mitigations in people's homes to make it safe, what changes you might need to do to the networks in order to make it safe and feasible. So assess those costs to be able to have an overall sense of the system costs, which will really drive people's energy bills in future.
The comparison I was going to make was with heat pumps, and we've been discussing the installation cost of heat pumps, where the cost is at the consumer end, unlike with the hydrogen. So that raises the further question: at the end of the heat pump's lifespan, will the customer be required to find the full cost of replacement, or would government subsidies be needed in perpetuity?
At present, the boiler upgrade scheme is for replacing fossil fuel systems with a heat pump. Now, heat pumps have quite long lives, so the average life of a heat pump is longer than a gas boiler. A gas boiler's lifespan is about 15 years. For a heat pump, it's more like 20 years. And so, once you get into a kind of we're still in the kind of first cycle of heat pumps in this country, given we've come from a relatively low base. When you get into a kind of second cycle, then that will be decisions in future parliaments as to the support that's available for consumers at that point.
There's a fundamental issue with hydrogen being a derived fuel. That's a really important. It uses energy to produce hydrogen, either through electrolysis or via gas and carbon capture through steam methane reformation, and there is an efficiency loss every time you produce hydrogen, and that is a key issue here. There was also the demands on the use of hydrogen to achieve net zero more broadly. Hydrogen is very valuable. It can be stored. And the question will be, what is the optimal use of hydrogen? Is it for the power sector? Mr. Grant, you highlighted the importance of intermittency. Is it for our industry? Is it for other maybe aspects of sort of heavy transport? Ultimately, there will be a merit order, is what economists would call it. And we need to use hydrogen, scarce resource, not cheap to produce, and we'll need to use it where it is most efficient. And we need to discover that as a department.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just a couple of quick ones from me. As we move towards more green electricity, there will be a reduction in the use of the gas network. So there's going to be potentially a value for money element to it as gas use reduces, and also there's going to be and ultimately there will be some decommissioning costs, one would imagine. So how are you going to handle that value for money issue, and who's responsible for funding decommissioning of the gas networks? Who's going to be responsible?
You're right that there will be issues around the future of the gas network. Can I just say at the outset, though, that we're going to need the gas network for some considerable time to come.
Yeah.
The National Infrastructure Commission has thought about starting decommissioning in the 2040s. Other people have slightly different estimates, but we need investment.
Look, we've looked at oil and gas.
We need investment as well.
We've looked at other areas. If you don't have plans for decommissioning early, we know that you can hit problems.
I absolutely understand that, and we will need to be increasing our work as a department to look at this. Actually, Ofgem currently have a consultation underway. I think it's closed. The consultation it's closed, and they're considering the responses, which is looking at the early issues around decommissioning the gas network. They're considering the responses.
So work is underway.
There's work underway. Ultimately, there are some big questions for future parliaments around where decommissioning costs should fall. The National Infrastructure Commission have estimated those costs at £25 billion in their recent report. That's not my number, that's their number. We'll obviously be looking at this as part of our strategic decision as well.
So the options are the taxpayer funds it through the Exchequer, the gas networks can do it, or there's a levy somewhere on customers or other energy.
They're the sorts of things you can look at, and there's always a balance between current and future and timing decisions as well. And
timing is key, because actually if there's a decommissioning cost to continuing to use for whichever way that falls, that might affect future behaviour. So
ultimately, it's a policy decision.
Yeah, absolutely, of course, absolutely. Yeah. But you are thinking about all of these options. Okay, Olivia Blake, MP.
Thank you, Chair. Just circling back a bit to my first question, what impact does delays to establishing an overarching plan to decarbonise the power sector have on your aims to decarbonise other sectors that rely on electrification, including home heating?
So I think we're working incredibly hard to proceed with actually decarbonising the power sector, actually, and for our major projects that the department is working on, we're continuing to work on the timetables that I think are well known to the committee. We'll be having a further auction round for renewables this year. That the starting process of AR6 has begun. We're continuing. We are in the middle of a capital raise process for Sizewell at the moment. I don't want to say more about that. That's underway. We're continuing to work towards final investment decisions on the carbon capture projects that are underway, and the clusters are underway. So there remains a lot of activity underway in the department. We are implementing the Transmission Acceleration Action Plan that the government has set out, and tackling the issue of connections, more work underway. So I don't accept that we've delayed that work. We're working incredibly hard to make progress on decarbonising the power sector.
So I guess the lack of an overarching plan that's public is probably the issue here. So is there any areas that you feel are falling through the gaps at the moment?
I think another way of thinking about it is where has any emphasis sort of shifted since the committee last met on this? Yeah. And I think the thing that I would say, and I alluded to this at the start, is we're putting greater focus on the importance of spatial planning and being absolutely at the heart of this. That's why we've made the decision to commission the system operator. We think they're the best place to do this, to develop a spatial plan. They recently published an update to their plan for the core networks, the Transmission Strategic Central Network Plan, the Transitional Strategic Central Network Plan, sorry, lots of acronyms here, and that needs to be now embedded in a strategic spatial energy plan as well, and that is, I think, the key thing that we need to do.
How much confidence do you feel the public have about the capacity of electrification, given some of the reports we've heard around planning applications not going to be accepted for new housing because there won't be enough electricity, etc.? We've seen these kind of headlines over the past couple of years. How do you think that's affecting?
We're making great. So the reassurance is energy security is key, and is the most fundamental thing that we need as a department to continue to do. And that's absolutely at the heart of everything that we do as a department, making sure that we do have the generation that we need to meet demand.
Just circling back to hydrogen as well, can I just ask if you think that the dropping of the idea of a hydrogen levy on households has impacted wide government policies? Because that was a mechanism of raising funds, I suppose.
So we're working towards. So the policy shifted to a different way of ensuring the support to a levy on gas shippers. It starts to get very, very technical, which we're still working towards bringing forward in that way. So what we did there is we've not saying we're not going to support hydrogen, but we're going to support in a different way was the key thing that we did there.
Just going back to the schemes and learning lessons, have you considered the potential pros and cons of a street-by-street approach? And do you think if the smart meter rollout kind of demonstrates that ad hoc approaches haven't really worked in the past?
Mr. Rimmington, perhaps on street-by-street.
Happy to. On street by street has its advocates. The challenge is that street by street is less good in terms of consumer choice and flexibility. There are also economic inefficiency risks, because the strategy that we have is around boiler replacement, and you should use your boiler so that it needs replacement. At that point, we will ask people to consider getting a heat pump. If you do a street by street approach, you're taking out that point of flexibility and that point of economic efficiency as well. On smart meters, just because you touch on it, progress has been actually overall we're now at 60% in terms of the meters in the country are now smart meters. We do look at lots of issues in terms of learning lessons between the two programmes because we see the similarities, we also see the differences. But that's the point on street by street.
Okay, what would make the current approach of demand-driven by individual households unviable and requiring a switch to an alternative such as street-by-street?
Well, maybe I should have said more, actually, because there could be some circumstances in which it makes perfect sense.
Yes.
So there could be certain types and tenures of housing, particularly in a social housing context, it may be exactly the right thing to do, because you might have technology that was all installed at the same time, you're going to replace it all at roughly the same time. So we definitely don't rule that out. And indeed, under the Social Housing Decarbonising Fund, effectively, there's kind of micro versions of that approach that we're already supporting. So it definitely isn't something, it's like so much in this space, it isn't a one-size-fits-all in terms of the way that you manage the transition.
If communities or local authorities wanted to approach you with that approach as an alternative, would that be welcomed?
So we are already, I think as Jeremy mentioned before, so we do an awful lot with local authorities in all kinds of ways delivering our schemes. The Pathfinder deals that we're doing with West Midlands and Greater Manchester are precisely to enable some places to experiment with different ways of doing things. And we're going to devolve money that comes from currently through national schemes in a single pot way to enable them to do more across different types of housing. Frankly, we will want to look at the detail of what they come up with their plans, but developing the plans will be up to them. And if, for instance, they want to come forward with those approaches, that's something we can definitely look at in that context.
And just back to Mr. Pocklington, on the auction rounds, obviously they haven't been that successful in previous rounds. How are you ensuring that there is going to be confidence in the market for this current round.
Yeah, so I think you're referring to the fact that in last year's auction round AR5, there weren't successful offshore wind projects. There were successful projects and a lot of low carbon generation was procured, but I think that's the point you're referring to. Well, in this auction round, we've taken a different approach. There is a separate pot, if you like. That's what we call it. Separate pot for offshore wind projects in this auction round. We've significant budget for the auction as well, and that will help ensure that there are successful projects. The other thing that we did is we used latest market data to change the what's called the administrative strike price, essentially the reservation price in the auction, to significantly higher than it was in the previous auction, and I think that has been sort of accepted by stakeholders that move was the right move. Obviously, if we had more budget, it'd be great, but we need to ensure that there is competition in the auction as well. Yep. But we'll continue to monitor that through the auction process. Is what we'll do.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Blake. Mr. Ben Lakenby.
Thank you, Jake. If I can turn your attention to paragraph 11 in the NAO report, which touches on the 20% or so of homes that might be exempt from the 2035 phase-out of new fossil fuel boilers. The government's already mentioned that some of the homes that might fall into that 20% may not be suitable for heat pumps for various reasons, including, we've mentioned it, we've talked about it, lack of space for the heat pumps, requiring energy efficiency upgrades, and so on and so forth. Can I just ask, what information will the department be using to identify whether or not a home is unsuitable for a heat pump and therefore exempt from the 2035 phase-out?
Yeah.
Mr. Cap.
Yeah. So I mean, we're some way away from this in the ambition to end the sale of new and replacement fossil fuel boilers is 2035. So the rules around exemptions to that would be at the same time, and obviously we'd consult in detail on what the rules would be and how that would be applied and so on, well ahead of that juncture. I mean, what the key test that we kind of used in assessing what the broad level might be, so how we kind of got to the 80%, was looking at kind of the heat loss survey that we touched upon earlier, and making assessment of the amount of additional insulation, or the fact that a house couldn't have sufficiently sized electricity connection. So those are the kind of main factors in coming to the 80% broad number. I mean, clearly in the time between now and 2035, one of the very key things we're keen to do is look at the alternative technologies. So it was that assessment is made on is important to distinguish on a low temperature heat pump. So there are higher temperature heat pump models which we've yet to assess properly.
When you say new technologies, we're not talking about here about hydrogen. You're talking about new technologies for heat pumps.
So we're specifically talking in it's most likely to be an electrification pathway. Or a lot of these properties are actually off the gas grid, so wouldn't be suitable for hydrogen, even if hydrogen was part of the mix. So it's what's the and so we're keen to consult on alternative technologies. Higher temperature heat pumps are one possibility, but there are others. There are people developing heat batteries that are starting to be deployed. Jeremy mentioned earlier HVO or bio-LPG. There may be a role in some properties for hybrid heat pumps, or it might be that the kind of combinations of these technologies become important in kind of niche cases where a heat pump isn't the solution that's going to work for that property. So we're keen. We've got more work to do, and we're keen to consult on these and also do additional trials where appropriate of these technologies.
Do you have I appreciate that's a lot of work to undertake. Do you have a timeline in mind as to?
Yeah, so we're keen to consult this year on alternative technologies, following on from the announcement about the 80% and and the exemptions, because I think it's important for us to have this conversation about, well, what is this 20% and what are the ways in which we can help people decarbonise their homes for those people where a heat pump might not be the most appropriate solution.
I mean, in terms of alternative solutions, what about domestic solar? I mean, solar's had its ups and downs depending on the feed-in tariff, but it's still popular, but it's not universal. So is that something that you're considering for the sort of properties that Mr. Lakin was highlighting?
Yeah. So I mean, it's not going to provide a year-round heat decarbonisation solution for the property as a whole. So solar can play a role. Lots of people, increasing numbers of people have it on their roofs, but it doesn't. You need something else. You can't just rely on the solar in order to decarbonise your home, which is why. We've moved, when we moved from the domestic renewable heat incentive to the boiler upgrade scheme, we kind of moved away from solar thermal and more towards heat pumps, because they provide the whole home solution.
If you're using solar to generate electricity, and when the sun is shining enough and doesn't have to be shining completely for it to be useful, there could be very large periods of time when the house does not need to use, the property does not need to use it from the grid.
Yeah.
And so,
Absolutely.
battery storage, which is something over a decade ago I was asking about these questions about battery storage, and we've still not progressed as much as we should. Mr. Rimmington, can you reassure us at all?
No, absolutely. We wouldn't disagree for a second. Increasingly people are doing solar panels as they do the heat pump. They do a whole house decarbonisation approach. And rooftop solar domestic is going to be...
It's expensive for someone to do solar panels, heat pump, all the insulation, and they might not live there for, there's always, there's just
all of this involves cost and transit and consumer journey questions, etc.
Just the thing, there are tariffs also increasingly in the market that optimise for the consumer's interest to take account of all these different factors in the house
get less,
as well.
less per unit for the electricity. So.
The only other point I was going to make was that in terms of heat pump innovation, it isn't only about high temperature heat pumps. Some of the practical constraints around space and so forth are being addressed increasingly interestingly by different operators and different manufacturers. So
it's a bit like the mobile phone. We moved from the big to the very small.
And who knows, I don't think you'll have a folding heat pump at that time. Otherwise
there's a challenge for British manufacturers. But I mean, look, it's been a very interesting conversation. It's slightly depressing that we go around these circles over and over again about consumers needing to buy in, but it's expensive to do so. There's huge challenges for all parts of the sector, lots of moving parts to bring together, but absolutely critical to deliver on this because of the 18% of emissions that come from our domestic housing and our very aged housing. So we will continue to keep a close eye on this. Of course, we're moving to the point where we're saying it's our successor committee that will do that, so we don't absolutely have control over that, but I think it will be an important factor for the Public Accounts Committee and the National Audit Office going forward. So can I thank you very much indeed for our time. Thank you to our witnesses. David Capper, first time, acquitted yourself very well, Mr. Capper. I hope the Permanent Secretary doesn't tell you off for being straight with us on things afterwards. And Jeremy Pocklington, the Permanent Secretary, and Ben Rimmington, thank you very much indeed. We will be publishing a report, this will be one of our we don't know, we'll be publishing a full report on this, probably at some point after the May Whitsun recess. Can I thank you very much indeed for your time. Order.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.